Hello and welcome to Tech Talk, an unusual episode of Tech Talk, it's fair to say, because all I was doing over the last few weeks was getting ready for spring break and heading off to Miami. But there's a lot more to talk about because we've had 3 thrilling Grand Prix and a bunch of testing and a fascinating new breed of Formula One car to look over. So I thought it was worth looking in more detail at this new breed of Grand Prix car and have a look at some of those details. So where should we start looking at these new cars? Well, the logical place to start would be the start, I guess. Now, I think a few of you may have seen a video that did the rounds in the run-up to the start of the season where somebody was talking about the Ferrari and how long it took to get up to full speed and how it had a starting advantage. Though thanks to Lewis Hamilton's antics, it didn't really demonstrate that well, particularly, did it?
Ferrari don't have to rev the car for as long. Let's have a look. Seems much the same to me.
Of course, once the season actually got going, we did get to see that Ferrari advantage in detail. No hiding it this time, Mr. Hamilton. Australian Grand Prix, keep an eye on the red cars towards the front of the grid. One of the McLaren's missing, and you can see what I was talking about. The Ferraris can unleash their power. They can accelerate particularly well off the line, to the point where some people have commented is it doesn't really matter where the Ferraris qualify because they're so quick on the start, so they'll make up a huge number of positions. And that's true for all of the Ferrari powered cars, though in this particular Grand Prix the Haas cars got blocked and the Cadillacs were too far back to make a difference. But this works in both directions. For example, the Audi also has a start characteristic, though it's less desirable because the Audi is losing a lot of positions off the start. So what's going on? Well, it's all about engine design. The Ferrari has a smaller turbocharger size than some of the other cars in the field, which means it can deploy its power much more quickly off the start line, though it may not be as good all the way around the lap. The Audi, on the other hand, has a much bigger turbocharger size than some of the other cars, meaning it's quite slow off the start, but it's quite quick around the rest of the lap. So it's a bit of a swings and roundabout situation. You go to Ferrari's position and have very good acceleration out of slow corners and great starts, or Audi's position, which may be more efficient around an entire lap, but means you're completely swamped every time the lights go out. Interesting situation, and one the teams are going to have to look at when they start thinking about next year's engines and how they're designing their entire car. Fascinating stuff to look at. But when we move on from the start, we've talked about start, so let's start with the car. At the start of the car, which is the front, the nose. And let's look at the noses of the car, and let's have a look at Alpine to start with. Now, I've just put Alpine here as an example, the team with a huge amount of wind tunnel and CFD testing allowance, but it's a good car to look at when you're looking at the different solutions, because Alpine's sort of there in the middle. There's nothing particularly radical going on with its front wing and nose design. It's just pretty standard. And you can see the new triple element front wings introduced for 2026. And you can also see Alpine have got a nice little strake underneath the leading edge of the front wing that extends, and some teams extend them right back onto the inner face of the front wheels, a bit like those old early 90s cars as well. You can see the design as well of the front wing end plate. Now, this is a crucial area of development for every single team. You've got the very clear foot plate here, and then you've got the vertical element, the end plate itself, and then this element that sticks out from the front wing and hasn't really got a proper name, has it? We'll just have to work that one out. The noses themselves are quite interesting. There's quite a few solutions, different solutions on display up and down the pit lane. Some teams have got narrow noses, some have got a slightly bulbous leading edge of the nose, but all the action, of course, is going on underneath the leading edge of that nose. But before we get to that, let's look underneath a front wing, because there's also quite a lot going on here. Earlier in the season, we got to see the Racing Bulls take their nose off the car, and as they lifted up the front wing, here's what I spotted. A couple of, a whole set of little aerodynamic elements on the underside of the wing, which looked to me to be managing the flow quite nicely around the front wheels, and that's something that a lot of teams, a little area of freedom that the teams are experimenting with, and you are going to see a lot of different designs in that part of the car once you get underneath the noses, which they don't typically want us to see, though here's a good one to look at. Then let's get round to the front wing end plates. This is an area of the car that we have seen no real engineering consensus on, and I think it's an absolutely fascinating area because the team's solutions are all so different to one another. They don't even, it seems like some teams don't really have the same direction as others, so that's really quite unusual. We haven't seen that in the sport of Formula One for quite a long time, where teams are going in such drastic different directions with different parts of the front wing end plates. And I'll highlight a few different areas to show you what I'm talking about here. So have a look at the angle of the sticky outy element on the outer edge of the Audi front wing here. You can see how it's nice and twisted and it's got an interesting design here. The other thing to look at is the tyre sensor on the trailing edge of the wing. Every car has these, but they're not all so obvious, and we're going to come back to that. And then have a look at this vertical element on the footplate. Quite small, quite abrupt, quite different to what you're going to see on some of the other designs. But let's move forward to some of those other designs. So back to Alpine. Note what you can't see here. No tyre sensor on the front wing end plate. As we come across here, you can see the very curved footplate. Reminds me of old Le Mans prototypes, that actually. Then you've got the standard vertical element, and then you've got their sticky outy element. And it's fairly similar in its general shape to the show car and to the Audi we just looked at. But where is the tyre sensor? Well, it's hidden down here, buried in the footplate of the end plate. You can barely see it there, but that is where it's located. And a few teams have this solution. I think Red Bull has this as well. And it's a really clever, really neat implementation of packaging a component that you know you're going to need, but you don't want it to cause a negative aerodynamic impact. And that's why they've shoved it there into the footplate. Nice detailing on that car. Cadillac, though, the newest team on the grid, have also been playing around on the footplate of the car. And here you can see an alternative approach to the end plate design. Note what's missing. There's no element sticking out from the upper edge of the end plate. However, Cadillac has gone down the road of, which a few teams are now beginning to explore, of adding vertical elements on the end plate. Now, these sticky uppy bits look very much like outwashing elements. As you can see, they're very much clearly trying to get the airflow to go like that around the leading edge of the front wheel, and that's something that a lot of teams are looking at, but not every team, because some teams are going in the opposite direction here, which I think is absolutely wonderful to see. And let's have a look at some of those other designs. Aston Martin introduced this layout on the footplate of their front wing at the Japanese Grand Prix. Twin element, like Cadillac, but they have one much larger element which looks to be doing a similar sort of job to the Cadillac. But have a look here, just on the back. They've got this extra long element here that kicks out and just channels that airflow out as well. So it's almost like a double element outwashing part, which is really quite intricate. Adrian knew it at work there. And then on the leading edge, they've got an angled component here that's going in almost a different direction. So this is when I say you can't really say what aerodynamic parts are doing without a CFD package or a wind tunnel. And the reason you can't is, well, do you think the air's just going to go like that and a bit like a pinball and go off down like that? Air and fluids don't work that way, and air, of course, is a fluid. And if you think I don't know what I'm talking about when I say that, look it up. So this is just where you have to trust that Aston Martin are getting it right with that showy new wind tunnel and their new head, or well, the new team principal, Adrian Newey, and how that design is working. And stuff like this is going to be studied by every other team on the grid. Let's take a look at the Haas design though, because Haas have always had a slightly different approach to front wing end plate design. In the previous generation of car, they had all those lovely little details on the outer edge of the front wing end plate, almost like a water slide at a theme park, some of them with those bumpy little sticky outy bits on the end plate. Well, Haas again have taken their own route on this design, and rather than having that very distinctive curved section on the outer edge of the footplate, the Haas is rather more boxy. It's got a rather large leading edge, as you can see here, which sort of extends underneath, and then this larger, flatter section that runs to the rear. It's very different in shape and concept to everybody else. But then you take a look at their upper section, the upper aerodynamic section. You can see very clearly the tyre sensor. That's pretty obvious, just bolted there on the top. Then you can see that the sticky outy section has no wing element on the end. It's pretty much just a flat surface with pretty much the same section front to rear. There's no wing chord, if you like, on that. Well, that's not the same up and down the pit lane. Let's take a look at the McLaren here. McLaren are one of those teams that have tried to hide the tyre sensor a little bit. You can just see it sticking out as a little nubbin on the back of that section. But look here, look how this section, again, no wing section, not a proper winglet, you can't call it that because it's not a wing section, but it does have a distinct downward trailing edge, which I think is very different when you remember the car we started out looking at here, where you look at the Audi with that upward section. So clearly a difference of opinion in the wind tunnel, clearly a difference of opinion in the CFD between those two teams. Moving on, staying around the front wing of the car though, we are still on the front wing. There's a lot to talk about, I did tell you that. Here's the Audi. Interesting car, lovely design. Changed it massively between testing and the first race, didn't they? Well, that in Bahrain introduced that massive upgrade, and we're coming back to that. Audi is one of those teams that has got two front wing actuators, because one of the big changes for the 2026 season, for the first time since 2009 and only part of 2009, the front wing has movable elements, and Audi has opted to move its elements or actuate its elements with twin actuators either side of the nose structure. Yet when they first tested the car, they only had a centerline actuator, so they clearly felt that that approach was the best one to go. Racing Bulls are in the same camp. Pretty much everybody else has gone for the single centerline actuator. So a little bit of a difference of opinion there. Again, different experimentation going on. I think with a bit of thinking time that the teams have got between the Japanese Grand Prix and the Grand Prix at Miami, you may see some more big changes like this come through. But with the cost cap and wind tunnel testing allowance as well, yeah, some teams will be hedging their bets with this, I think, a little bit. But these movable front wings and how they're deployed have caught a bit of attention, particularly in the case of Audi's bitter rival, Mercedes. Now, in the opening races of the year, at a few points, it was noticed that when the front wing active aerodynamics on the Mercedes were actuated, they opened up as normal, but they didn't necessarily close all the way up within the 0.4 seconds allowed within the regulations, and they had a little second phase of movement. Now, some teams said, oh, that's not really allowed, or we're not sure about that. Mercedes had to come clean and admit that their system wasn't working exactly as intended, and it got a bit sticky, and it wasn't adjusting back to the position it should have done, and they believe it was costing them time in those opening races, though Mercedes were doing quite well, so them costing them time, it's a bit of a worry for the other teams, isn't it? Well, the FIA seemed to agree with Mercedes' opinion, and they had developed a new system, and they introduced that and got it fixed. So still some worries, still some wobbles about the actuation of the front wings, and you can see some of the teams modifying it. This is the front wing actuator on the Haas. It's quite mechanical, quite clunky. You can see the linkages here, you can see the hinging as well. Then take a look at the McLaren front wing actuator. It's much neater, very small, thin rods, which if you think about the amount of load that must be going through them when they pull that wing back into position, it is quite a challenging bit of structural engineering, but of course you don't want big clunky structures interfering with the airflow over your wing, and as we go further back on the car, well, you're going to see quite a bit more of that. Of course, with all of that active aerodynamics, gubbins inside the nose structure, and the fact the nose structure is a bit more significant than it has been in recent cars because it's got two sets of front impact structure within there. It's a two-stage system to improve safety. What happens if a car, or a driver more likely, has a bit of a boo-boo out on track, particularly maybe they're coming out of the pit lane and might bump into another car or even the pit wall? It has happened this year. People want to know what happens when you change the front wing, particularly how long it's going to take. It's going to take a lot longer than normal. Well, we put that one to the test with McLaren during pre-season testing, and this is what happened. It's not the best representation of a nose change. We have actually seen some much quicker ones than that. I took this video myself actually, and I was eavesdropping on some of the mechanics, and they were trying to tell each other, explain to each other what the different settings on the front wing were, because they didn't know the terminology at that point. So it's still everybody learning a lot more about these cars. But with the front wing removed and some other bodywork bits removed, we get a look at the front brake system here on the Williams. Now, front braking and rear braking and braking as a whole has changed quite considerably since last season because the hybrid system is so much more potent. The demand on the brakes is different. I wouldn't say it's higher or lower, it's just different. And on the front brakes, there's been quite a lot of change and conceptual change on how the teams are cooling the brakes. So Williams is one of these teams that doesn't have conventional brake scoops on the inner side of the front wheel plate. Instead, it's channeling all of that airflow inside this front wheel plate here in the gap between the rotating tyre, not fitted in this picture because we want to see what's going on in between. And you can see all of these little aerodynamic elements on the inside trying to manage that airflow through the cooling sections of the wheel, the brake discs, brake caliper, brake pads inside the cake tin there, but also trying to get a bit of good airflow, a bit of extra downforce around that front wheel wake as well. So it's not just about brake cooling, it's about managing that front wheel wake. And this is what you sort of end up seeing. You don't have that conventional inlet scoop on the front wheels like this, which is what you'd normally see here with the sort of gills or something like that. That's not present on some cars, Ferrari, for example, Mercedes. Instead, they have this section here, and you can see where the brake airflow is channeled through. It's pretty similar, but they've removed the scoops, and that's quite a big change year on year. But it's not the only change in that area of the car. So when you turn your attention from the inner face of the rear wheel to the section underneath the nose, and this is an area teams absolutely hate you looking at. In fact, Audi spent quite a lot of time in pre-season testing trying to stop me from looking particularly at this part of the car, which was a great indication of that there was something worth looking at, and there certainly was. But first of all, I'll show you the basic leading edge of the floor of the car. This is the section that some people sometimes refer to as the T-tray. Here you can see the base of the chassis coming down, and this is just the front of the floor here, extending rearwards, and that's pretty much your conventional front floor of a modern racing car, modern Formula One car. You can even just see the leading edge of the plank there on the underside, and that's something that a lot of teams got to manage. Then you take a look at the Audi. It's got holes in it. This is something that I had to go and ask someone how the rules interpretation could possibly be legal, because I thought that the rule said you couldn't have holes in your floor like this. Well, Audi have really cleverly interpreted and correctly interpreted the regulation to allow them to install these holes along the leading edge of the floor. That's what they seem to want from their airflow, and it's seemingly working for them quite well because they're sticking with it. Whether other teams have time to investigate this, I'm not sure. But this area, this leading edge of the floor, is a great area of different technical ideas on this new generation of car. Have a look here, this is the Alpine, and you've got these two small vertical sections sticking up either side of the front of the floor there. And that, again, looks very small, looks very insignificant. Little details like that make all of the difference when it comes to managing the airflow around the car. And this area underneath the nose is super critical to the overall flow. You've got to think, that airflow is coming off the front of the floor, going down the side of the floor, into the floor. That's really going to have a big effect, even though it's just a tiny little piece. How much of an effect? Give me the decent CAD model and the CFD package and I'll tell you. They're not going to let us do that, by the way. Not yet, anyway. So other teams have gone for slightly more subtle interpretations. Williams here have, which I just think is fascinating, and we've had this image before on Tech Talk, and this is one I took in pre-season testing. You've got these little tiny aerodynamic elements just sticking out from the leading edge of the floor, pointing in very different directions, as the team have looked at the airflow in the wind tunnel, looked at the airflow in CFD, and decided these tiny little sections here all have different roles to play to getting the air to do what they want around the front of the floor. Really clever little bits of design. Does it work? Well, we'll have to wait and see. The Williams hasn't been super competitive so far, but we think there's a lot more to come from that design. Whew. Right, where should we go next? Bargeboards, a bit of a British house. Strange naming for different bits of the car. Bargeboards have sort of returned under the new regulations, but they're not really bargeboards as we knew them previously, those aerodynamic elements on the side of the car that sort of ran along like that. No, these are the new bargeboards, and these are part of the new regulation package, an aerodynamic element that sits extending forwards from the front of the floor. You can just see it here on this car here, the Mercedes, You've got this extra section that comes all the way forwards like this, and the teams have got quite a lot of freedom on the vertical section, what they do with it. And you've got some different design solutions on display. And we're going to go through a few of those little details. So Mercedes has this very neat little triple stack of elements here. Some of these do get a bit more complicated. And you see this little additional metal section on the outer edge of the Mercedes. But when you see some of these from different angles, the engineering of them, the little intricate details start to become more and more apparent. Let's have a look at Aston Martin, because they've been playing around with their design quite significantly. So they've gone for initially quite a large plate on the top, single plate, but with a remote forward section and then these two horizontal sections underneath. Fairly standard for some of the car designs earlier in the season. But the sharp-eyed amongst you might notice something a little bit more complicated going on here. That's unique to Aston Martin. Another section of the floor edges that seems fairly innocuous, should I say, is this link section that runs between the chassis and these bargeboard sections. And that's just to make sure they don't fall off too easily or don't get too flexible. But the teams have been given quite a lot of technical freedom with how they've been designed. And a big element like that, it's going to have an aerodynamic effect, isn't it? It's like a suspension arm. And of course, it's quite a big aerodynamic element, isn't it? And you can see what teams have done if you get a bit closer on the Aston Martin design here. Look at this central section of the linkage. Well, there's no denying that is purely for aerodynamic purposes and has absolutely nothing to do with the stiffness and keeping this vertical section straight and rigid as it should be within the regulations. That is a little extra wing, and completely allowed in the regulations. Aston Martin taking full advantage of those regulations, it's pretty clear to see. And with their position in the Constructors' Championship right now, they're going to have a lot more time in CFD and the wind tunnel come June and July, when they're probably still going to be last in the championship. We don't know that because it's unpredictable, but they could do quite a lot more with this car. I'm pretty fascinated by it. And you can see some of the areas they are exploring with it. This is on the interface of the Aston Martin's bargeboard section, and you can see how that remote element is linked to the outer element, which is much larger. And you can see all of these intricate little details. There's that little winglet section I was just showing you, but also you've got these two sticky uppy bits sculpted out of this scalloping on the leading edge of the floor. This is hugely beautiful, intricate engineering design. I'd love to see some of the CFD numbers on this, but I suspect every other team in the pit lane would love to see the CFD numbers on this as well. Do they have enough time to develop their own versions of it? I'm not sure they do. And speaking of teams with a smaller amount of wind tunnel allocation, here's Red Bull, and this is their interpretation of exactly the same part of the car. It is nice, it's good execution, but it's not as intricate as the Aston Martin design, and that is the impact of those aerodynamic testing restrictions. You just don't have the time in the wind tunnel to develop such intricate solutions. Now, Red Bull does have some really intricate details on this part of the car as well, but maybe not as much as Aston Martin. Some teams have gone for some really innovative approaches. Williams have got this very interesting vertical section, which is completely remote from the rest of the barge board. It's almost like they've been watching 2001: A Space Odyssey and have come up with something that's got the aerodynamic department quite excited. No team has come up with another section like this. I mean, maybe they're inspired by Standing Stones or something. They are in the Vale of the White Horse area, aren't they? And then other teams have come up with some different designs like this. You've got these sticky innie bits, which is a new bit of terminology, I guess, for Tech Talk, but can't think what else we'd call it. But there you go, they've got a couple of those little elements. So all of these teams going down different directions with different parts of the car. So much more to come, and I absolutely love it. The team that I think has done some really clever stuff, of course, is Audi, who've been playing around with their area of the car here, changing their sidepod inlet design and raising the leading edge of the floor, trying to get a bit more downforce out of it. And I think that's a really interesting approach, totally different to every other team. And I do quite like the design of the Audi, even though it's not really producing the results right now. I've got them in my F1 fantasy team, so I hope they will improve a little bit. But speaking of cooling inlets, it takes us to other cooling designs. Here's the Alpine, which is a very standard cooling inlet design, and I think you're going to see a bit more development coming on around that part of the car. But these new power units have very different cooling demands, and the teams are still finding their way about the best ways to cool these new power units and how they can get the aerodynamic drag down as much as possible. And some teams have opted for centerline cooling approaches. Here you can see the Cadillac with the Ferrari power unit. They take some cooling airflow from these outer segments of the roll hoop here and here. But other teams, Ferrari, the works team, only use a standard roll hoop alignment, and they just have the central section and do all of the rest of the cooling down in the side pods of the car, even though between Cadillac and Ferrari it's absolutely identical power units. So different approaches to cooling layouts, which does suggest that there is still some uncertainty of how these cars can be best cooled. And then you take a look at the Racing Bull with that gigantic airbox behind the driver's head, which is, well, eye-catching, it's fair to say. But when you're talking about cooling new power units like the one in the back of the Racing Bull, not that one, different sort of Ford power unit, that they are trying to get a bit more flow just to make it as efficient as possible. And the smaller you make the coolers, the lower the drag of the car overall, so you can get that straight line speed. And Cadillac's kind of missing, well, quite a lot of speed at the moment, but that is going to come from that team. Looking around the rear of the car, again with the Cadillac, there is still quite a lot of technical freedom. And again, this is another beautiful area where there's still no consensus of engineering, the rear floor of the car. And you've got to wind the clock back a little bit to about the 2020-2019 seasons, where this area of the car was getting hugely complicated, lots of slots and slits and holes. Those regulations were simplified, and that rear corner of the car calmed down a little bit by regulation. Then going into the 2022 generation of car, it wasn't as critical at all. But now we've sort of rewound those regulations, got rid of ground effects and come back to it. And there's a lot more technical freedom here. And we are seeing some hugely complex design solutions here. Now, Cadillac is one of a couple of teams that's got a double-decked section just ahead of the rear wheel. You can just about see it here. But here you see the rear floor of the Aston Martin. And it's got, and what I wanted, the reason I brought this one in is it's got holes. Now, previously, this part of the floor had to be single and continuous, which meant teams were creating tiny little slits running out to the outer edge of the floor just to make it legal. That's not needed anymore. They can just have fundamental, simple, straight old holes in the floor. Audi managed to do it at the front with some clever interpretation of the rules. This is just the rules. You're allowed to do that now, and holes in the floor are something that have got a lot of people's attention. While you can't really do it on this section of the floor, as you come back towards the rear of the car, you do start to see some teams running what some people have called rodent holes or mouse holes. And interestingly, some teams also refer to that as mouse traps as well as mouse holes or rodent holes. Well, anyway, this bit of the floor here, everybody's talking about what you can fit through it, and what they want to do is get a lot of airflow through there. And again, we're back to those pre-2022 era cars where teams were doing all sorts of stuff, even if you go right back, using blown diffusers and going into that sort of technology where they're trying to essentially prevent sort of lots of dirty aerodynamic flows coming off the base of the tyre and going into the diffuser and mucking up your underbody aerodynamics. And that's what a lot of this is all about. Here's McLaren's solution to the rear corner of the floor. I like this one. It's very, very curvaceous, very neat, but is it most effective? McLaren hasn't really done much technical development on its car so far this season. That is about to change because it had a tiny amount of wind tunnel allowance because it had won the World Championship 2 years in a row. So you don't have a very big wind tunnel allowance as a result of it. Here you see the Alpine rear floor, similar to the McLaren, but a lot more angular. There you go. And then Ferrari's interpretation with this vertical element sticking out and over. Again, expect to see stuff like that become loads more complex, like you see here on the rear diffuser of one of the cars with a very small, looks quite vulnerable, sticky backy bit, downy bit, I don't know, bit that sticks out the back of the diffuser. And if you want me to tell you what that does specifically, you really are going to need a wind tunnel and CFD, because that sort of level of intricacy on the bodywork is utterly impossible to work out just by looking at it. And speaking of intricacy, Ferrari have found new areas of the rules to play with as well. Jumping back forwards, because we can't really ignore what Ferrari have been doing when they're playing with the rules and pushing the limit, because I think they, more than any other team, have found a way to, well, cook up some new ideas. You've got these little winglets which were used on the car during a sprint qualifying session, but then were then later removed after a few teams asked how that was allowed within the regulations. Nobody could show that it wasn't allowed, but rather than Ferrari having to go and fight and take a risk that maybe they'd pushed the regulations a bit too far, they removed these halo wings from the car. Maybe they're going to reappear later in this season. Maybe somebody else is going to try it. But speaking of Ferrari, you've got to talk about the back end of the car. And I am, of course, going to talk about the exhaust exit. I'm not talking about the rear wing yet. The exhaust exit on the Ferrari has been a source of great interest because Ferrari introduced this double element, I don't know if you could call it a winglet, but it's a plate that sits behind the tailpipe. And Ferrari have been able to introduce this design using a zone of freedom on the rear bodywork, which has only been opened up because of the positioning of the differential in the transmission casing. Yet that's how complicated the technical regulations get. Ferrari have opened this up, and you can see on some of the track footage the exhaust plume and how that's being affected. And that is something a lot of teams have just gone, wish we'd thought of that. And we can't change our gearbox now, so we can't really copy it. And another team that's come up with it, of course, uses the Ferrari power unit, is not Cadillac, because they don't use the Ferrari transmission, so different differential positioning. Not sure they have the ability to do what Haas has done, because they do have the Ferrari transmission, and they've got their own, shall we say, slightly scaled down version of the Ferrari exhaust plate, which you can see here. Does it work? Is it effective? Well, Haas seem to think so. They copied Ferrari, and you can see the aerodynamic shaping of it very clearly there. The thermal characteristics of those components, bear in mind how hot that exhaust is. You can see here the thermal sticker that goes all the way up to 154 degrees centigrade. In other words, it's going to be quite hot to touch. I wouldn't go near it. And what happens with these stickers, they will heat up like a thermometer, almost like you put on a child's head. And if it gets to a certain point, you know, oh, the sticker's burnt off. You can see one that's sort of filled itself in there as well. It's gone to the top level. Ferrari's rear wing. We had to get to it, didn't we? This is the one some people call the Macarena wing. I absolutely hate silly names like this because I can't even understand why it's in the Macarena position. It doesn't do that. It's a flippy over, turny over wing, or a rotisserie wing, or it's just a really interesting bit of aerodynamic design. Ferrari noticed something in the regulations that allowed them to rotate the upper elements of the wing fully. So put the wing completely upside down to try and generate a little bit of lift rather than downforce, and in turn significantly reduce the aerodynamic drag of the car. Now, Ferrari hasn't actually raced this yet because I think there is some concern that the time it takes for the wing to fully rotate open and closed may just be on the limit of the 0.4 second allowance in the regulations. Rumour has it, I haven't got any particular extra insight, that Ferrari are planning to bring a revised version of this wing to one of the next few races, maybe Miami, maybe Canada, to allow them to actually finally race it and be able to use it more reliably. So they just want to get it working properly before they introduce it. But when you look at this, you can actually see it's not just the rotational function that gives them an advantage. By not having I nearly called it a DRS actuator, an active aerodynamics actuator pod in the middle of the wing here, they actually have a bit more wing surface to play with, only by a few millimeters, but it is there and it does all make a difference. And when you look at the size of some of the other teams' wing actuators, here's Alpine's, you can start to see that actually removing that whole structure, which has got weight, it's high up on the car as well, centre of gravity height, but then of course Ferrari's wing has some actuators in the end plates here, which also have weight, and that's quite high up in the car. You've got to monitor that. But it does give them a bit more wing surface to play with on the car. So that's a little extra bonus to Ferrari's wing technology. But it's not the only team playing around with their rear wings. Mercedes have got these extra elements on the outer edge of the wing as well. That's a 4-element wing in my opinion, and I'm amazed no one's yet come to the conclusion where they can copy that. But this extra section on the top of the wing, very clever. Little loophole in the regulations being exploited there by Mercedes. You saw the active aerodynamics actuator and the size of it in its conventional trim, but Alpine have actually introduced an additional, what looks to me to be a downforce generating winglet on the back of that pod. Now, we've not seen anybody do that to date so far. There's no structural purpose to that, it's purely aerodynamic. And I think it's just Alpine exploiting another little area of the technical regulations that nobody else yet has really played with. But then Alpine were the team that had got a really interesting interpretation of the rear wing to start with, where the elements drop down when they're actuated rather than split open like the old DRS. Something that Audi copied with its most recent iteration of the rear wing as well. So clearly Audi finding the same advantage as Alpine. I wonder, are other teams going to go the same route as the season goes on? It's pretty fascinating when you see them actuated. For now though, I mean, that is a very quick run through, and I mean very quick run through, of some of the development trends of the 2026 season. But trust me, there's so much more to come.